There have been countless reports of alleged encounters with extraterrestrial beings over the years. Most involve a single witness describing a strange sighting that lasted only a few fleeting moments before disappearing again. But the cases that attract the greatest attention are those in which multiple people, often unknown to one another, come forward with accounts that appear to describe the same phenomenon. Such was the situation that began to unfold in rural Wyoming during the mid-1970s. A sequence of bizarre encounters that would eventually lead witnesses to claim they had come face to face with a mysterious race of beings known only as the Star People. Even with the widespread growth of the internet and social media in recent years, public reactions to alleged UFO encounters often remain deeply skeptical. Those who choose to speak publicly about such experiences often find themselves subjected to intense scrutiny. In many cases, investigators will look carefully into the background of the individuals involved. Personal histories, past statements, and lifestyle details may all be analysed in an effort to determine whether there are any factors that might cast doubt upon the reliability of the testimony being presented. Other commentators approach the matter from a more technical perspective. Photographs or video footage that accompany a report are frequently studied in detail, with analysts searching for signs of manipulation, misidentification, or optical illusion. Even the smallest irregularity in an image can sometimes be cited as evidence that a sighting may not be as extraordinary as it first appeared. Yet, every so often, a case emerges which manages to capture wider attention despite this atmosphere of skepticism. These are the incidents that involve multiple witnesses, or which occur across a series of locations within a relatively short span of time. When this happens, the story can begin to take on a different character. One such case began to take shape in rural Wyoming during the mid-1970s. Against a backdrop of widespread reports of cattle mutilations and unexplained lights in the night sky, several residents of the region came forward with accounts of encounters that seemed to share a common theme. On the afternoon of the 25th of October 1974, a pickup truck belonging to the AM Well Service slowly pulled to a halt along the edge of the Medicine Bow National Forest in southern Wyoming. The vehicle had been borrowed earlier that day by one of the company's employees, Carl Higdon Jr., who had travelled out to the remote woodland with the intention of spending a few quiet hours hunting elk. Higdon was 41 years old at the time, and had built a reputation amongst his colleagues as a dependable and easygoing foreman. Away from his job, he was known to enjoy spending time outdoors, and like many residents of the region, he was a capable hunter who was comfortable navigating the forests and open country that surrounded the town. Earlier that year, Higdon had purchased a new 7mm Magnum hunting rifle and had been eager to put it to use. The forests surrounding Medicine Bow were known to support a healthy population of elk, and the trip was intended to be little more than a routine hunting excursion. But when Higdon failed to return home later that evening as expected, concern quickly began to spread throughout his family. His wife Marjorie initially assumed that he may simply have lost track of time whilst out in the woods. As the hours passed, however, and there was still no sign of him, her concern grew into genuine alarm. Eventually, she contacted the local authorities and reported her husband missing. At the same time, she began telephoning friends, neighbours, and several of Higdon's work colleagues, asking if anyone had heard from him or might be able to assist in searching the surrounding countryside. It would not be until close to midnight that Carl Higdon was finally discovered. When searchers reached the location of the AM Well Service truck, they found him sitting alone in the driver's seat. He appeared disorientated and strangely withdrawn, offering little response to those attempting to speak to him. Higdon was transported to the Carbon County Memorial Hospital, where medical staff began assessing his condition. When Marjorie arrived later, the sight that greeted her was deeply unsettling. The man lying in the bed before her seemed almost unrecognizable from her husband, who had left home earlier that day. His eyes were red and watery, and he appeared physically unsteady, struggling to walk without assistance due to an overwhelming sense of dizziness and imbalance. Yet the most distressing discovery came when Marjorie attempted to speak to him. To her shock, Higdon appeared unable to recognize her. Over the following days, fragments of memory slowly began returning to him. Eventually, Higdon told Marjorie and his children that the experience had begun whilst he was walking quietly through the forest in search of elk. As he moved between the trees, he noticed a group of 5 animals grazing in a small clearing directly ahead of him. Carefully raising his rifle, Higdon took aim and fired a single shot towards the animals. But instead of the sharp recoil and thunderous report he expected, something far stranger occurred. The rifle produced neither a sound nor any kickback against his shoulder. Even more bizarre was the sight of the bullet itself. Higdon later claimed that the round appeared to leave the barrel as though it were moving through thick air, travelling forward at an impossibly slow pace. Then, after covering only a short distance, the projectile suddenly stopped in mid-air, roughly 50 feet away. The bullet appeared to flatten and distort, as if it had collided with some unseen surface suspended in front of it. At precisely the same moment, Higdon's entire body violently convulsed. He described the sensation as being similar to an electric shock, causing every muscle in his body to seize at once. The sudden force of the experience threw him backwards, sending the hunter crashing to the forest floor. For several moments he remained there, struggling to regain his senses. When he finally managed to sit upright again, he realized that he was no longer alone. Standing nearby was a tall and imposing figure. The stranger wore what appeared to be a tight-fitting black suit of some kind, and attached at the waist was a prominent yellow emblem, shaped like a star. Although the being seemed broadly male in form, its appearance was unlike any human Higdon had ever encountered. The skin was dark yellow in colour, and the head was covered in thick strands of material that resembled coarse straw rather than natural hair. Where normal ears should have been, 2 unusual protrusions extended outwards from the sides of its head, bearing an uncanny resemblance to insect antennae. Its mouth was equally unsettling. Rather than possessing lips, the lower half of its face appeared to contain little more than a narrow slit. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the figure was the fact that it did not appear to be standing on the ground at all. Instead, it hovered silently just above the forest floor, suspended several inches above the ground where Higdon lay. As the hunter slowly struggled back to his feet, he glanced around the clearing and noticed that the elk he had fired upon was still standing exactly where he had first seen them. But something about them was terribly wrong. The animals appeared completely motionless, frozen in place as though time itself had somehow stopped for them. It was at that moment that Higdon noticed something else nearby. Hovering just above the ground, a short distance behind the strange figure, was what appeared to be a metallic craft. The object was cube-shaped and entirely featureless, with no visible doors, windows, or markings of any kind. Most striking of all, it produced absolutely no sound. And then, just as Higdon believed the situation could not possibly grow any stranger, the figure floating before him began to speak. The being introduced itself to Higdon as Orzo-1, before calmly asking him how he was feeling. Still shaken and struggling to comprehend what he was seeing, Higdon found it difficult to respond. Sensing his discomfort, the strange entity reached into its suit, produced a handful of dark-coloured pills, and offered one to the bewildered hunter. According to Higdon, the effect was almost immediate. Within moments of swallowing the pill, he began to feel calmer. Regaining his composure, he rose to his feet and continued speaking with the unusual figure. After a brief exchange, he eventually agreed to accompany Orzo 1 to the silent craft hovering nearby. In later years, Higdon underwent sessions with a hypnotist in an attempt to recover additional details of the encounter. Yet even under hypnosis, he was unable to explain exactly how he entered the vessel. There was no visible doorway or opening anywhere on its surface. One moment he recalled standing in the forest beside the cube-shaped object, studying it alongside its dark-suited occupant. The next, he found himself inside. What immediately struck Higdon was that the interior seemed impossibly large, the space within the craft far exceeding what its modest exterior dimensions suggested. He had little time to examine his surroundings, however, before the scene shifted once again. After the briefest of moments, he realized he was no longer inside the vessel at all. The forest had vanished, and in its place stretched a strange and unfamiliar landscape, dark and silent beneath an alien sky. Several meters away stood a tall structure resembling a tower, and Orzo 1 motioned for him to follow. The two entered the building together, where Higdon discovered some kind of lift waiting inside. This lift carried them upwards through the structure. During the ascent, Orzo 1 explained that they had travelled an extraordinary distance, more than 160,000 light-years from Earth. At the top of the tower, Higdon was startled to see he was not alone. Standing within the chamber were several other humans who appeared just as confused and unsettled as he was. Amongst them were animals, including several elk and other forest creatures similar to those he had encountered earlier. There followed a brief and uneasy exchange between those gathered there. Then a loud and disembodied voice echoed through the chamber, informing Higdon that he was no longer required. The next thing he remembered was opening his eyes in a hospital bed, with his wife staring down at him. At first, Marjorie found her husband's account difficult to accept. But several days later, whilst washing the clothes Higdon had been wearing when he was found, she discovered something unusual inside one of his trouser pockets. It appeared to be a bullet. More specifically, it was a perfectly flattened round. Marjorie's disbelief deepened further when she accompanied Carl to a follow-up medical examination. Doctors discovered that the kidney stones which had previously troubled him had disappeared. Even more puzzling was the fact that several old scars on his body, left behind from a past bout of tuberculosis, were also gone. Marjorie was not the only person left perplexed by the strange details surrounding the incident. Police officers who investigated the location where Higdon had been found also raised unusual questions in their report. The AM well service pickup truck was only a two-wheel drive vehicle, yet it had been discovered deep within a remote stretch of terrain that should have been extremely difficult to reach. The truck itself had become stuck in thick mud and required considerable effort to recover. Yet, investigators were unable to locate any tire tracks showing how it had reached that location, nor were there clear footprints in the surrounding area belonging either to Higdon or to anyone else. It was almost as though the vehicle had simply been placed there. In the period following the incident, Carl Higdon agreed to give newspaper interviews describing what he believed had happened to him in the Wyoming wilderness. The attention brought skepticism, mockery, and intrusive scrutiny, and Higdon soon decided he wanted no further part in the publicity surrounding the case. He returned to his job and attempted to resume ordinary life, only occasionally agreeing to speak with a researcher or undergo a polygraph test. Beyond that, he avoided interviews and made no effort to profit from the encounter. Just as importantly, he never made any changes to his story. The central details remained consistent, even as the years passed and public interest faded. Eventually, researchers began linking his account to another strange series of events involving Wyoming resident Pat McGuire. At around the same time that Higdon claimed to have been taken to a distant world, McGuire, a well-known rancher near Laramie, had been dealing with an unsettling problem on his own land. He operated a sprawling ranch of some 5,000 acres, and during the summer of 1974 had made repeated complaints to the county sheriff that unknown persons appeared to be killing his cattle. Several animals were found dead under disturbing circumstances, with features such as their ears and noses removed in a manner that seemed both deliberate and precise. Alarmed by the repeated losses, McGuire and his workers began keeping watch over the ranch at night. As the stakeouts continued, the men reported seeing strange lights moving silently above the property. These objects did not behave like conventional aircraft. They maneuvered without sound and occasionally descended to the ground some distance from the main buildings. When the witnesses managed to get closer to one of these lights, they claimed to see a metallic craft resting on the land, from which tall, shadowy figures emerged. Each time one of the objects appeared, McGuire would discover another mutilated animal the following morning. Eventually, determined to put an end to whatever was happening, he enlisted the help of a worker named Jimmy Ashley. The two men concealed themselves at an isolated point on the ranch and waited in darkness. Before long, one of the objects they had seen before descended once again. This time, however, the two men stepped out from their hiding place and moved to confront the trespassers. As they drew nearer, McGuire noticed something unusual about Ashley's behavior. The ranch hand appeared to slip into a strange, trance-like state, his attention fixed entirely on the object. Without speaking, Ashley dropped the equipment he had been carrying and walked straight past McGuire towards the craft. Then he slowly reached out and placed one hand against its smooth metal surface. The moment he made contact with the object, the ranch hand was suddenly engulfed in what McGuire later described as a sheet of rolling flame. With a cry of pain, Ashley collapsed to the ground and began rolling desperately across the dirt in an effort to extinguish the fire that appeared to be consuming him. At the same moment, the craft shot upwards into the air, accelerating rapidly away into the dark sky. McGuire rushed to assist his employee, who was still crying out in pain. Yet, when he reached him, what he discovered was deeply unsettling. Despite the flames that had appeared to engulf him moments earlier, Ashley's clothing and skin were completely unmarked. In the days that followed, McGuire reported the incident to the police and explained that Ashley had never seemed quite the same afterwards. The ranch hand soon left his job and moved away from the area. Sometime later, McGuire agreed to undergo hypnosis in an attempt to recall what had taken place that night. McGuire now recalled that he had experienced multiple encounters with the occupants of the craft he had observed, whom he referred to as the Star People. Each of the beings was identical in appearance, standing well over 6 feet tall and heavily built, yet somehow moving in such a way that their feet never appeared to touch the ground. They possessed abnormally large eyes, but where their mouths and noses should have been, there were only shallow indentations, with no supporting features. Much like the being encountered by Higdon, the Star People were dressed in black bodysuits of some kind, each featuring a distinctive star-shaped buckle. In addition to taking tissue samples from his cattle, the Star People warned McGuire of a climate apocalypse that would wipe out much of humanity. They instructed him to dig wells all around his property and to stockpile as much water as possible, so that he and his children might endure the trials ahead. For years, McGuire's neighbors and fellow residents had insisted that the land on his ranch was unsuited to irrigation. They were therefore stunned when he went on to locate several underground water sources there, and produce working wells with ease. Unfortunately for Maguire, with each period of hypnosis, his ability to process the information emerging from those sessions appeared to weaken. He began warning others of the danger and claimed the Star People had instructed him to father as many children as possible, so that his lineage might survive the catastrophe. It came as little surprise when his wife finally chose to leave him, taking their children with her and leaving him alone on the ranch. In 1982, Pat Maguire decided to run as a candidate for state governor, but his stories of alien abduction brought only humiliation, failure, and financial ruin. He was not treated seriously by the wider community and was eventually forced to leave the ranch he had worked so hard to maintain. Shunned by family and friends, he ultimately died alone, surrounded by newspaper articles and notes about the Star People he claimed to have encountered. The two Wyoming accounts share similarities not only in what was described, but also in the effect the experiences appeared to have on the men involved. Neither Carl Higdon nor Pat Maguire had any known history of mental illness or substance abuse. Before the incidents, both were regarded by friends and colleagues as practical, hard-working men with little interest in attention or notoriety. There was no obvious incentive for either of them to invent such extraordinary claims. One possible explanation is that Higdon suffered some form of psychological breakdown during his hunting trip, perhaps triggered by isolation or stress. In time, Maguire may have learned of the story and consciously or otherwise allowed it to influence his own recollections. Yet, this interpretation does not easily account for all the evidence. Higdon's disappearance and subsequent medical treatment were documented in hospital records, whilst investigators also recorded the unusual condition in which his vehicle was found. At the same time, police reports confirm that a series of cattle mutilations occurred on Maguire's ranch, supported by statements from several of the men who worked there, including regarding the strange lights. Taken together, these details create a deeply uncomfortable possibility. If the accounts are even partially true, then something unexplained was taking place in that corner of Wyoming during the mid-1970s. And if something otherworldly really was visiting those remote ranchlands back then, the most unsettling question may not be why they came, but whether they ever truly left.